Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 27th of September, where I am putting some closure onto Frankenstein. And if you look at the notes below, you can see that in our section that says next class, we are beginning Edgar Allan Poe. So I was fortunately able to find some links online where you could access Poe's stories for free. We obviously aren't reading all of Poe's works. He was quite the prolific author. But I selected The Fall of the House of Usher, which if you ordered the Dover text that I had assigned as a text for our class, that would be on page 14. But as you know, you can use any edition that you'd like. The Mask of Red Death, that's on page 57 of the Dover edition. The Telltale Heart, that's on page 74 of the Dover edition. And The Black Cat, that's on page 108 of the Dover edition. So what would be ideal is that you would have all four of those short stories read by next class. But next class, I'm also going to be talking about specifically writing papers, since I'm hopeful that at this point, now that we've talked a little bit about possible paper topics, and as you know, I selected a quote from Emily Dickinson that you could use in relation to one of the texts that we are studying. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. But you are also free to create your own paper topic as long as you have the topic approved by me and as long as you are discussing one of the texts that we are discussing in class. But more on that next class. And what my hope is, and again, I understand that life isn't always ideal, is that since we've got two classes devoted to Edgar Allan Poe, you can begin the next set of readings. That happens to be a novella, which means that it's longer than a short story, so it's longer than Edgar Allan Poe's works that we are addressing. But it's not as long as a novel, so it wouldn't be as long as Frankenstein. And that happens to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You'll also note that soon, the beginning of October 9th, actually, I believe, we have Native Indigenous Peoples Day, so there's no class that's scheduled on that day. So I, of course, will post something on our Moodle that there is no class that day. And in terms of thinking about Frankenstein, I went through approximately up until chapter 19 or so, where the creature prior to that had talked about that he was able to discover his origin through some papers in the pocket of a dress that he had taken from the laboratory upon his creation. Again, notice how important letters are in terms of the storytelling technique and how often we get narrative embedded within narrative. And of course, the creature at this point has decided that he is going to demand that Victor create a companion for him. And there are multiple ways that we can see this request, this demand, let's be honest. Certainly, we empathize with the creature who doesn't want to be alone and deserves to have companionship. But the idea of creating a creature solely for the benefit of another living being, especially a male creature asking for the creation of a female, becomes a lot more complicated. That's actually going to be the attendance question for today, which I will talk about again at the ending of today's class. But basically, the attendance question is going to be, do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature, and why? And again, as is true of most of the questions I ask, no right or wrong answer. I'm more curious in your reasoning skills and your analysis. And of course, the why is the most important piece of that particular question. We know that Victor initially begins to create a companion and then convinces himself that it's a bad idea and ultimately destroys the work that he has henceforth done. The creature witnesses all of this because the creature has been stalking Victor, and at that point the creature decides that it's going to enact revenge on Victor, and in a very clever way, because ultimately the best way to hurt somebody is not to hurt them, but to hurt the people they love. So This ultimately means that the creature will be targeting Clerval. And we talked about how interesting that relationship was, this friendship that seems much more intimate, actually, than the friendship that Victor has with Elizabeth. In fact, some scholars have even read some homoerotic elements within the text, but we don't get enough to be able to make any kind of definitive conclusion. What we do know, however, is that Victor is devastated and destroyed when Clerval is murdered. And even worse, Victor is accused for the crime, even though he's innocent. Keep in mind that this is exactly what happened with Justine. And Justine was innocent of killing William, and Victor never intervened. So perhaps there's a little bit of justice there. I'm not certain. The creature declares in chapter 20, I shall be with you in your wedding night. And Victor has lots of flaws within his character. Certainly he's filled with hubris, excessive pride, and certainly he's filled with great arrogance. So the way Victor hears that is that the creature will be stalking Victor on Victor's wedding night. The creature never says that. The creature says, I will be with you on your wedding night. Of course, the creature targets Elizabeth. And as I indicated in some of our discussion forum responses, I say the creature because the monster really is more an accurate description of Victor's behavior. First, usurping the laws of God by creating life in an unnatural way. And secondly, by negating his responsibility to his creation. And we could broaden that to humanity as a whole acting monstrous by rejecting this creature initially purely because of its appearance. Now certainly the creature engages in some rather negative behavior, but as the creature says, this is in response to its initial treatment. And think about how these issues have such contemporary relevance. How much is a child responsible for their own upbringing? And when that child becomes an adult, how much of that upbringing should be considered in terms of their actions? So in many ways, Mary Shelley was talking about these timeless and universal themes. And one of the reasons why I would say that Frankenstein indeed is a piece of literature worthy of analytic study. It's not just written in order to entertain or to generate profit, that there's a lot of depth and that there's a lot of sophistication in there. Just thinking about the way the narrative is told within letters, or the ways that the characters share similarities, Walton to Victor and Victor to the creature, are just some examples. So the murder of Elizabeth, of course, leads to Victor deciding that he's going to enact his own revenge. And what we get is a kind of chase scene. Keep this in mind when we read Dracula, where, for lack of a better word, father and son are pursuing one another. Victor is pursuing the creature so that he can destroy it. The creature wants to be pursued. He leaves enough clues so that Victor can pursue him. The idea that they both hate one another, but they also can exist without one another. And what does that say also about troubled parent-child relationships, if you wanted to put a contemporary spin on this? And eventually, this is where Victor, in chasing the creature, ends up meeting Walton at sea. And we know that it's time for us at this point to return to our frame, which might have been easy to forget because we're getting everything in the first person here. But ultimately, this is Walton's narrative, as we had talked about, based on Victor's recollections. And in fact, at this point, Walton hasn't even had any interaction with the creature itself, though he will shortly. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that even though Victor continues to maintain that he's telling Walton this story because he doesn't want Walton to make the same errors that Victor has done, that at one point in chapter 24, Victor tells Walton's mutinous crew, they're thinking about mutiny, be men or be more than men. Be steady to your purpose and firm as a rock. He's encouraging them not to turn back from what seems to be a death mission. So as much as Victor says that he's learned from his experiences, it's put into question throughout the novel. As I had suggested earlier, all of his responses, I felt as if I myself were guilty, is a way for not completely accepting responsibility for his behavior. The creature ultimately has a conversation with Walton. And again, keep in mind that we only get Walton's perspective, so we don't know whether or not the creature exists. And certainly, Walton could have been influenced enough by Victor to have hallucinated the conversation that he has with the creature. Though, as I had indicated, usually the text is read as having a level of validity to it, because then many of the interesting issues that are raised in it are negated if this is all a hallucination, let's say, from Walton. Unless this is his subconscious trying to give him lessons about the futility of trying to usurp the natural order and seeking knowledge in places where man should not seek knowledge. But the creature talks a little bit about his need for vengeance, and that he mentions, I was the slave, not the master, my impulse. This is something that we will oftentimes see in Gothic texts, servitude and mastery, and the idea that emotions get out of control and the negative consequences that result from that. And ultimately, the creature decides, and this is very different from what Hollywood provides us with, that it's going to commit suicide. This is in chapter 24. I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. And now that his creator no longer exists, there really isn't any reason for him to continue to exist. One could see this as a kind of noble action, but of course, if you are Hollywood, you don't necessarily want to end the film so there's no possibility of a sequel. So, that said, we know that we've got The Bride of Frankenstein and we've got lots of other films, and they don't necessarily all connect because in our 1930s Frankenstein film, Frankenstein is indeed killed. And the idea is that Victor and Elizabeth will live happily ever after. It's a very kind of different sense with the novel, although we assume that the creature will kill itself. Notice how Shelley left an opening for a possible sequel, not that she was writing for Hollywood. And I wanted to just address a few more quotes, which I had started with last class. As I had indicated, the creature saying, I will be with you on your wedding night. This is in chapter 20, and how Victor receives that news is a very important line. As well as in page 203, where Walton is talking about that in his last letter, he had entertained the fear of a mutiny. And of course, this is where Victor responds and says to the crew, what do you demand of your captain? Are you then so easily turned from your design? Did you not call this a glorious expedition? And wherefore was it glorious? And he continues on, and basically he ends by saying, do not return to your families with the stigma of disgrace marked on your brows. Return as heroes who fought and conquered, and who know what it is to turn their backs on the foe. And I think this says a great deal. It's in chapter 24 about how little understanding Victor has even at the ending of this tale. If there's any positive ending to this story, it's that Walton has decided to turn back, so perhaps he's learned. Or we as audience, reader, have learned some of the lessons that happen to be embedded in the text. And what that means is that we would not duplicate some of the same errors that Victor Frankenstein has within our own lives. But as I was saying earlier, and this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but not completely tongue-in-cheek, that I wish Frankenstein were required reading for the entire scientific and technological community, because it seems that this idea of creation without thinking about consequence is something that happens generationally. And as I had began the semester talking about artificial intelligence, I think that perhaps this might be the moment where or at least I fear this might be the moment where our creation can no longer be controlled. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, and I highly recommend it, it certainly talks about the atom bomb and the impossibility of controlling it, though thus far, um, even with a few blips, it seems to have been controlled enough so that humanity continues. So, that said, I would encourage all of you to sort of think about the idea of how Frankenstein could be applicable to our current times, because that's really what makes a great piece of literature, that it's timeless and universal. And when we get to Edgar Allan Poe, one of the things that Lovecraft had talked about in supernatural horror and literature was Poe's ability to talk about psychological states and psychological horror. And as we know, the Gothic oftentimes provides a certain level of ambiguity, so that if you don't feel comfortable embracing a supernatural explanation, well, then you can embrace a more naturalistic explanation. With Frankenstein, we see this with the problems with narration, that all of this could have been a figment of Walton's imagination, or perhaps a figment of Victor's imagination. But as I had discussed, I think that Frankenstein very much deserves to be in the Gothic tradition, if for no other reason outside of the heavy emphasis on setting, this idea of Victor pursuing um, un unknown knowledge from some of the great spiritualists and occultists of the time, such as Cornelius Agrippa, and learning about the Philosopher's Stone, as well as, and the text doesn't get into too many details, Victor's behavior, which ultimately he's going to charnel houses and he's finding corpses and putting those pieces together. But that said, Frankenstein is oftentimes read in science fiction classes, because one could argue that this is a science fiction text, that it is possible to create life from death. It's just our science has not gotten to that point. Electricity was a rather newfangled invention at the time, or discovery, I should say, at the time. So the idea of the possibilities of science are embedded in this text. And as you know, the fact that we've got a text written by a female author who makes a deliberate choice to give us a very male-centric perspective, or at least a male-centric story, I think also is indicative of how this text is important from a gender perspective. So, as I had indicated, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the actual construction of writing a paper. As you know, I've given you that Emily Dickinson quote as a possibility: one need not be a chamber to be haunted. And we began the semester with just basically some introductory readings when we were reading Stephen King's Danse Macabre, just to sort of give us a sense of the Gothic, and also Lovecraft's supernatural horror and literature. So Frankenstein is really the first Gothic text that we've read, and we will be reading Edgar Allan Poe, and we will be reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. By the time we're done with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that would be around the date in which the first paper is due. As I had indicated, I have a rolling deadline for the first paper, so the sooner you get it in, the better off you are. But by mid-semester, I would hope that all of you have that first paper submitted, because that's an awfully long time not to have a major assignment yet evaluated for the course. And you are going to have a very similar topic. In fact, you're going to have the same topic for paper number 2, which is due at the ending of the semester. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. Responding to Emily Dickinson's quote with some of the later set of readings that we would be doing in the semester. Dracula. Now, Dracula kind of straddles both the beginning and both the first part of the semester and the second part of the semester. I suggest you probably want to leave Dracula for paper number 2, just because we wouldn't have put closure to discussing it. And the hope is that these class discussions and our discussion forum responses can help inform your thinking and your writing about how to proceed with the paper. So thinking about Frankenstein, how could that be applicable, that one need not be a chamber to be haunted? And perhaps the way to think about that is to think about some of the major characters in Frankenstein and whether or not they are haunted, and if so, why? Whether that be Walton, and that could be an entire paper, or you could talk about multiple characters. Victor, of course, the creature, of course. Even Elizabeth or Justine, if you wanted to, or the Lacey family, if you wanted to talk about some fewer known characters. We will examine how one need not be a chamber to be haunted in The Fall of the House of Usher, but the actual house itself is also haunted. And we'll talk about how it works from a literal level, but also from a symbolic level. That's probably the hardest of the short stories. I wouldn't at all be surprised if you've already read Mask of Red Death or The Telltale Heart or The Black Cat. Those are oftentimes common pieces because they're shorter and they're usually easier to understand. So they're oftentimes done in the K through 12 level. And definitely you will see with Edgar Allan Poe, there are themes that he tends to revisit over and over again. And as you know, with Gothic literature, there will always be the possibility, or at least with the text that I've selected from Poe, there's the possibility of the supernatural, but there also is enough ambiguity so that you could select a naturalistic answer if you so wanted to. So you can read Poe with the eye of thinking about the paper, and you can do the same with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the next class, I wanted to talk about the paper in greater depth. So at this point, what's left is our attendance question. This will be the last attendance question we have for Frankenstein. And keep in mind that you might want to adapt one of the attendance questions to a paper topic. But again, if you create your own paper topic, you want to have it approved by me and talk a little bit about why you're choosing that particular topic. So the attendance question will be due on Friday the 29th. And as you know, if you need an extension, just ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So you can see that I've been responding to all of you. I read everything that you write. So that would give you a sense of what we would talk about in a class discussion. And in this instance, the question is, do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature, and why or why not? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about writing papers and Edgar Allan Poe. Take care. Bye-bye.